Hello, my name is Jeremy, this is Red Beans Recording, and this video was brought on by a request I had from my recent self-playing patch videos where I went through the Hydrasynth and made a couple patches that sort of like played themselves in a pretty way. And one of the things I mentioned in that video was choosing quote-unquote safe notes to allow a probabilistic sequence to play around with. And I thought it was a really neat idea. It's something that I use all the time in modular, and I wanted to talk to you about it. It's just kind of some basic scale theory, but I thought it could be a cool video. So we're going to start here in the DAW, and then we're going to take it over to modular and put it into practice. So I'm going to assume that if you're watching this still, you don't really know a ton about music theory, and hey, that's fine, I don't either. So what I have in front of us here is a program called Scalar, and it's going to be our visual guide in helping us kind of figure out some of the relationships that notes have, because I think it's really important to combine the eye and the ear. It can help a little bit. So what we're seeing here on Scalar right now is the C major scale. The blue highlights here represent the C major scale. If we change our notes to something else, we will see a different scale highlighted. So let's go ahead and go back to C real quick, just because it's easy for me to play in. And let's talk about the concept of intervals and dissonance, because this is a big part of how I approach the quote-unquote safe notes when it comes to generative or probabilistic stuff, or even just my regular compositions when I'm throwing things at modular and trying to get it to work together. So in a scale, when you say something like C major scale, the note that is the first letter in that thing, in this case C, is what we call our root note or our tonic note of the scale. And, you know, this can be at different octaves. So that's our root, our tonic. That's what we're going to think of as the resolving note in terms of our scale when we're moving around in different chords. So C major, we can go down to a different chord. But once we've established C major, it's going to sound like home for us, or whatever chord you've established as your main key chord. So root note, C. D is called the supertonic. This is the second. The third is the most sort of important in the scale, aside from the root. This defines our root note, but this defines our major or minor key. So if I take this, which is currently at a major third, and go down, we get a minor third. So if I change this to minor scale, you'll see that now we have a flatted third, and we have some other changes here. There's a couple different types of minor, but we'll get into that in a second. The fourth, the perfect fourth, and the perfect fifth. These are your best friends in any context. And interestingly about the perfect fifth as an interval, we don't have any inherent sense of what major or minor is, because we're not hitting a third or any of the other notes that would normally determine our key for us. So this is a really mutable, as is this, mutable sort of, interval. And I rely on these intervals quite a bit in my generative stuff. Same thing with the supertonic. These do not have a lot of information about what key we're in, and therefore can be applied to a major or minor context. So let's show that off real quick. So what I can do down here on the lower hand is play a major third. So that works with that. What if I was to play a minor? Still works. What if I was to play a major but in the a different chord? Still works. What if I was to play a flatted major in a different key? Hey, look at that, still works. So the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and supertonic to an extent, the D in this case, all really play well with a lot of stuff that you can throw at your composition. And the next we have the sixth. So the sixth is kind of interesting. It can have a minor relationship depending on how you invert it with the thing. So basically, if we play C major, and if I change my left hand to play the sixth, we're going to insinuate an A minor scale, which is really, really nice. You can notice I'm still playing the perfect fifth up here, and in the context of the A minor, it becomes the 7th, excuse me, becomes the 7th. So anyways, we'll get more into the relationships a bit more. And sorry if I say the wrong, music term. I'm not a graduate of music performance school. I dropped out in my first year of theory. So sorry, music theory people. After that, we have the 7th. This is a really, really interesting note, and this is going to give us our entry point into talking about dissonance. So when we play like a triad, which is the main sort of like basic chord of any key, when we play this with the root on the bottom and our 3rd and then our 5th, that's a normal triad, not inverted or anything like that. So if we were to make a 7th chord by adding the B, we get a very beautiful, dreamy thing. And I love 7th chords. They sound great both in major and minor. So here's a major 7th. Here's a minor 7th. Oh, they sound kind of good. Modulating. Okay, so what you may notice is, though, that this note is right under our tonic. And if we were to play these right next to each other, that wouldn't sound very good, right? That's like a semitone away from our tonic. The human ear, us people, we are pretty much trained at this point to recognize dissonance as something we want to get away from. So if we're playing 2 notes right next to each other that are like not really that great sounding together, we're going to want resolution. But when we spread them apart, it sounds wonderful. This adds a pleasing dissonance. We don't want this necessarily to resolve, but the chord's more interesting because we're playing a 7th on top as opposed to just that. You could add a 9th, and it's even dreamier. So dissonance is really, really interesting, but you have to be careful with it. When you have full agency over what you're playing, I will, when I have full agency over what I'm playing, meaning I'm playing it from a traditional keyboard standpoint, I will introduce dissonance a lot more. If I'm using modular gear, where I don't have full control over necessarily the way that notes will interact with each other, but I do have control over the notes, I may steer away from using possible dissonant notes because I don't want to introduce, I don't know, probabilistic dissonance too much. It's just kind of how I roll. We've determined that there are some notes that are more pleasing than others in terms of the relationship to the tonic, and that they also are very mutable when it comes to playing other things with them. In fact, there's a very classic form of dissonance that I think we're all familiar with, and that's called the suspended chord. So the perfect 4th introduces dissonance between the perfect 5th and the 4th. And here's our tonic. It wants to resolve to something. It probably wants to resolve down to that major 3rd. So we use suspends all the time to create momentary pleasant dissonance because we're using the perfect 4th and the perfect 5th to then resolve down to the perfect 3rd, the major 3rd. So keeping in mind that certain notes have certain relationships with other notes in the key, and some are going to sort of like play better with others, is the basis for how I approach that quote-unquote safe note kind of idea when I'm making generative patches or stuff like that. And I mean, I got it to a great extent from listening to like Brian Eno's music for airports, especially that intro track. But it also applies to things like Steve Reich's, music for Six Marimbas and something like that. Anything that depends on this concept of not purely probabilistic cycling or probabilistic note order or something like that, but where there's the concept of a combination between probabilistic and deterministic, where you set something up and then let it kind of do its thing. So in like Steve Reich's music for Six Marimbas, there's like this cycling sort of like, and then like he'll introduce another marimba that's going on top. And the combination thereof like provides a really, really beautiful cycling thing, because there is inherent dissonance occasionally, but he's being very, very careful with the notes that he's having these different timings cycle through. And same thing with Brian Eno's intro track for Music for Airports. It's just this really simple chord that he's arpeggiating through, or, you know, piano line that he's arpeggiating through. One of the things that's kind of fun to do is, like, if you find a piece that you really, really like the sound of, you know, maybe sit down at a keyboard or something, like, and just play some notes along with it so that you can kind of get a sense of what the tonic is and what kind of dissonance they're getting away with in the track. The scale and key that you pick will determine a big part of your music, and then you start constraining notes based on that so that you can create more order and have these relationships that, you know, introduce dissonance in certain cases. You constrain them so that you're avoiding too much dissonance in your probabilistic sequence. When it comes to things like using arpeggiators and random voltages to feed a quantizer, you want to be more constrained with the range of values that you are sending into it and out of it. So with that said, let's go over on to the modular rig and fuck around and find out. I've run out of fingers. All right, just before we get started, there are three voices at play here. There's Brad's, there is Plonk, and there's the Basimilus Iteratus Alter. Those will be our three voices as we discuss how to use quote-unquote safe notes in a patch that is probabilistic. The sequencer is going to be René Mark II, and the way that René works is it only advances through its 16 steps when it receives a clock or a pulse. So we have Pamela's new workout sending out 16th note pulses to both the X and the Y sequencer. The third sequencer, the Cartesian sequencer, pulls data from those two in terms of how it passes through its thing. We have a kick drum coming from Peak being triggered by Steppy just to give us a little beat to keep our rhythm grounded. And we have a reset signal being sent out to reset these sequences to the beginning. We may or may not turn that off as we go through. I'm just going to leave it on for right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit play and we're going to adjust these knobs here to give us some pitch variation. And then we're going to play around with Quant over here to move from a sort of chaotic chromatic experience to a more harmonious experience. All right, so let's hit play and start going. The first thing we want to do is start to introduce some pitches. So I'm going to start turning these knobs. Let's go over to Y and do the same thing. Sounds great so far, right? Wow, that's beautiful. This is what happens when you get when you just use a chromatic scale in the context of something like this. So if we go over to the Quant page, we'll see that every single note is being accessed, and that's why it sounds like shit. So let's start constraining our notes, and we're going to start with that tonic, supertonic, perfect fourth, and perfect fifth, and see what we get. That's a lot better. Let's go ahead and spread our notes out a bit more. The other thing we can do here is increase and decrease the number of octaves that this is going to spread over. It's one thing you need to think about. Melodies generally don't get spread over a huge amount of octaves, and neither do bass lines. So the next step we want to do is we want to come over here and create rhythms as opposed to just having 16th notes, because this is not super interesting. So we're going to do Euclidean rhythms on both of these, and we're going to do them differently. So remember how I said one of the things that we want to do is sort of constrain both rhythm and note? we've now created a more predictable event that's also more interesting. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go over here to 7, which is feeding the X clock, which I believe is going to Brad. And I want to slow it down. I lied, it's going to the BIA. So, I like to take my baselines and I like to slow them down a little bit usually if I'm going to be using probabilistic notes. Because the relationship of the tonic note, the low note, is really what defines our experience of a possible chord. So I'm going to introduce the ability to go on my X thing here to a couple different notes. I'm going to include that B flat to be able to go to mixolydian. Oh, it's going to Planck actually, my bad. The Cartesian sequencer is going to BIA. So we actually don't have control over the speed of the Cartesian sequencer. But you can hear that we're getting that B flat in here now every once in a while. It's kind of an interesting relationship. So Brad's is our most busy thing right now. Let's go over to Brad's and let's go ahead and change up the notes we have available to us over here. So I gave Brad tonic, minor third, perfect fourth, and the mixolydian 7th, I believe. So it's a B flat. So we get that minor feel. So let's constrain our notes a few more ways and just experience what different types of constraint do for us. There's our mixolydian 7th and our tonic. Very, very classic sort of Italo disco sound. Let's do just the black notes on the piano keyboard. So that's D flat, G flat, A flat, and B flat. Well, that's very nice, isn't it? So you don't have to only choose the same notes for each one of your constraints. I can choose not to include these two down here. I can choose not to include these two down here. I can choose not to include those two here. And now what I've done is I've created a almost chordal relationship between the three sequencers because they're all going to play in the same theoretical constraint, the same implied constraint, but they're creating melody because they are playing from different sets of constraints, which I think is really cool. Playing with the constraint that's going to your bass, in this case our BIA, I can introduce chord progressions because I'm only letting it play one note. So I'll switch the tonic note now and hear what this progression sounds like. So we're all picking from the same notes that we have available to us on the other things here, but we're moving through and changing our tonic, which changes the relationship of those notes, which I just think is really, really cool. As we've been listening to this, your brain has probably accepted this rhythm as something that we expect. You are anticipating its movement, and that's created structure from the piece that we're creating, which I think is really, really important. Let's change the structure and see how much different things sound. Seventh doubles as a minor in this case, so we can introduce the perception of a minor key. So that's about all I have to say on that. We can constrain notes over here using relationships that are going to be not dissonant unless we really intend dissonance. And then we can change our rhythms, constrain our rhythms to create the perception of structure, and then play around. Let's switch this back to a major seventh in the key of C and see how that feels. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you have any tips, tricks, comments about your favorite uses of harmonic constraint in the context of a semi-probabilistic system like this, do leave them in the comments. I'm always curious to hear what people have to say. As always, thanks for watching, and my name is Jeremy. This is Red Means Recording, and I hope you have a wonderful day.